right, ladies and gentlemen, real quick. Before I introduce our guest, I just want to take a moment. There is a somber kind of mood to the topics being discussed, so please make sure you're on your best behavior and respectful to our guests. But before we have our guests speak, I want to introduce the Wahoo High School Choir. They'll be performing a piece called I Believe. The lyrics from the song come from a poem that was found inscribed on a cellar wall in Cologne, Germany, where Jews were in hiding from Nazi persecution during the Holocaust. Here's the high school choir performing I Believe. At Wahoo, we've been very fortunate to work with the Institute for Holocaust Education to bring in speakers so they can share their stories and experiences during World War II. The Institute located just in Omaha, Nebraska, which is phenomenal. So many of the survivors of the Holocaust have sadly passed away over the years. Now, in order to carry on their stories, in many cases, we have second and third generation survivors telling their stories, the stories of their parents and grandparents. Today, we have the great fortune to have Rochelle Brown Rainey here to tell her mother's story. In 2016, we had her mother, Magda Brown, here at Wahoo High School to speak at this very event. Now I'd like to invite Rochelle to the stage to tell Magda's story. Let's welcome.
Hi, thank you for that beautiful song. It was so special. As he said, my name is Rochelle, and this is a picture of my mother, Magda Brown. She passed away at the early age of 93. My mother had an incredibly positive spirit. She was relentlessly optimistic. She loved people and loved visiting with people. Can you guys hear okay? Okay. And she just enjoyed being with people. It didn't matter if you had just met her or if you had known her for years. Matter of fact, after her speaking engagements, lots of times kids would come up and give her grandma hugs. I had the great privilege of traveling with my mom over the course of the last 15 or 20 years. I listened to her words over and over again, and I was always in awe how she could share such horrendous moments in her life, how she could publicly share them. She was on a mission to share her story. Her exact words were, "My hope is that through sharing my story, I can personally talk about the horrors of the Holocaust to remind this generation of the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and discrimination." You know, I used to call it her story, but in fact, it's my story as well. Because of the Holocaust, I grew up never knowing my maternal grandparents. I never got to meet aunts and uncles and cousins, and I never even got to meet any of my mother's childhood friends. Excuse me. I grew up wondering how good people, could turn so evil and so inhumane. I don't guess I'll truly ever understand. I just don't understand. I want to start by sharing with you one of the things that my mother taught my brother and I. She taught us to respect all people and to try to not hate anyone. That's a powerful message from a woman who lived through unspeakable discrimination, hatred, and loss. I'd like to share her story of surviving the Holocaust with you today. My mom, Magda, grew up in a town in Hungary. Let me see if I can do the clicker right. Okay. And Hungary is down here. So I put it in this kind of map so you could see it's by like Poland and Germany and Romania, because it's a little country. People can't always figure out where it's at. She lived in a house that held 6 people. Her mother, her father, her brother Miklos, and an aunt and an uncle lived with them. She went to school, had friends, had a regular little girl's life, and she always described it as a wonderful home life. Her parents owned a meat market. Okay, that's pointing to the town where she was born. Her parents had a meat market where they sold like deli sandwiches, and she always considered herself a bit of a spoiled brat because she was the only little girl in the whole family. And by the way, these 2 pictures of her as a child and her parents in the store are the only 2 of 3 pictures that I have of my mother's life before the Holocaust. And I'll show you the 3rd one in a bit. Over time, her non-Jewish friends wouldn't play with her anymore. They wouldn't hang out. They wouldn't talk to her. She knew that some people didn't like Jewish people, but this had never happened. She had no idea what was going on. When Hitler came into power, he was determined to recreate the world the way he wanted to see it. He wanted everyone to be German, have blonde hair and blue eyes. He saw no purpose in people that didn't fit his ideal. Hitler didn't like lots of groups. He didn't like Catholic priests, Jehovah's Witnesses, Sinti Romas, which are the gypsies. He didn't like homosexuals, people with disabilities, political opponents, but most feverishly, he didn't like the Jewish people. The Nazis entered Eastern Europe. The killing machine really showed its ugly face. There was propaganda depicting the Jews as ugly and mean people. They were just drawings, and they would be up on the walls in the public spaces. And people believed them. They didn't have the internet, they didn't have social media, they didn't have fact-checking. But if there were posters that all of a sudden these Jewish people were ugly and greedy and selfish, people tended to believe them. Hitler wanted other people to see the Jewish people just like he did. He wanted them to hate that group. It's called a scapegoat, when you blame a group for all your problems. Even the children were taught to hate. There were games where it was about killing the Jewish person. There were songs about killing. It's hard for me to imagine. I've raised children. To teach somebody to hate is beyond my comprehension. There were laws coming in place that prohibited Jewish people's employment as well as professions. So take, for instance, the pharmacist, the doctor, the lawyer, the store owner. They were no longer allowed to have a business license, so they couldn't practice their business. So all of a sudden you have all these people unemployed, plus no services that were there. So if you needed medication and the pharmacist wasn't allowed to practice anymore, you were out of luck. Hitler invaded Hungary in the spring of 1944, and he quickly made Jewish people put the Star of David, and it was like a patch, they had to sew it onto the arm of their clothes. And even small children had to have it sewn on their clothes. This was to label people and to start making them inhumane. Just no identity of their own. They were just a Jewish person. Another restriction that really hit my mom hard was that this is her 8th grade graduation picture. The restriction was that only 1% of Jewish students were allowed to go on to higher education. Now I'm talking to this age group. Can you imagine graduating 8th grade and being told you can't go to high school? Well, there's some good in that, don't get me wrong, but the idea that she was just told she can't, she was just out of it. So that was devastating to her as a young girl. Mom always said that genocide does not happen from one moment to the next. They take away your material goods, your liberty, and you're lowered to less than an animal. Hitler decided that one part of the towns should be called a ghetto, and the other half should be where people are moved to. He was trying to consolidate the people. So people were told that they had 1 hour to pack a bag of 2 or 3 days' provisions and be on the street in 1 hour. People were completely confused. They didn't know what was going on, but they had already seen people getting brutally beaten up, shot, killed, tortured on the streets. So they complied with what they were told. They packed a little bag of supplies. Usually it was some clothes, a little bit of food, maybe some mementos like a picture or candlesticks. I know for all of us, we probably would have packed our laptop, our tablet, our phone, and all the 8 million cords that go with it. And that would have gotten us nowhere. Mom's house happened to be on the other side of town. It's a picture of the people being herded out of their homes. And I put this picture in here on purpose because you could see the people are nicely dressed. These are real brick buildings behind them. This was 80 years ago, not 5,000 years ago. They were nicely dressed, civilized city people. Mom's house happened to be in the side of town where the ghetto was to be. Her house that usually held 6 people was now the home for 40 people. There was no human kindness. The Nazi soldiers just shoved in 40 people. They didn't ask, do you want your grandma to stay with you? Do you want your cousin to stay with you? They just shoved people into the house. Said it was beyond crowded conditions. There were just people everywhere. Some people were crying, some people were praying. People just didn't know what was going on. The only thing they could figure out was they were all there because they shared a religion. Being Jewish is a religion. She said that, as she said, she always thought she was a spoiled brat, but it was the first time she said she really learned to share because other kids in the house didn't have hardly anything. So she shared her clothes, her toys, her books, even her hairbrush. She shared everything because she had so much in her room and they had nothing. Most of the soldiers were cruel and heartless and described as the most inhumane creatures in the world. They would go into houses and just take whatever they want. People were too scared to fight them. They had already witnessed so much cruelty. Of course, some people tried to run and hide, but it's very unlikely that they succeeded. They were more than likely killed. Most importantly, the Jewish people were no longer protected by the Hungarian police. The Hungarian police decided, or the Hungarian government decided to follow Hitler's final solution. A short time later, everyone in the ghetto were told to be on the street in 1 hour. They were told, okay, listen to this, they were told the war effort needed workers. They were told that the families would stay together. This was the biggest lie of the 21st century. They were shoved out of their homes and made to walk a long distance through the streets of their town. They were pushed, shoved, and yelled at. The words were sharp, mean, cruel, and devastating. All they knew was they were being treated that way because they had a shared religion. I can't even imagine how my grandparents must have felt walking past the store that they had built and worked at 6 days a week. My grandfather, from what my mother said, was a very proud World War I vet. He was a very proud Hungarian who served on all kinds of committees in the town, not just Jewish ones, but all kinds of city committees. And here he was being forced to leave his home and get pushed down the street like a nothing. So that had to be devastating. They walked for hours, and they ended up at a brickyard. A brickyard has nothing in it but bricks. It's a brick ground with bricks piled up. They had no idea why they were there. Unfortunately, they found out quickly. On my mother's 17th birthday, on June 11th, they were pushed into cattle cars. The railroad tracks led right into the brickyard. These were trains made to hold cattle. They could hold maybe 25 cows in them. Instead, there were 75 to 85 people shoved into these boxcars. There was no space to move and not enough room to even sit down. There were 2 buckets in the corner. One was for water and one was for the toilet. Needless to say, the water was gone the first day. There were people praying, people moaning, people crying, people sick, people swearing, and people disoriented. They were in a dark box, caged in like an animal. Mom tells the story of one woman who was in the corner holding her baby. She was trying to nurse her baby, but sadly the baby was already dead, probably from malnutrition, because they had already been running out of food. Mom said one day she was pushed over to a little window in the corner. It had barbed wire across it. It was probably the size of my laptop. And she said out in the distance, she saw this beautiful green plush fields. They were going through the Carpathian Mountains. It was June, it was beautiful. And in the distance, she saw a shepherd minding his flock. All she could think was, why is he out there and I'm in here? I was a good girl. They traveled for 3 days and 3 nights. Mom stood for most of the time so her parents could sit down on the hardwood floor. Mom said one of the worst things about being locked in the boxcar was thirst. She had gone 3 days and 3 nights with no drink at all. Now, if you think about it, we've all got our water bottles. I've got 2 things up here. I've got a Diet Coke and a water. Just imagine, even on a hot summer day, going 3 hours without grabbing your water bottle, let alone 3 days and 3 nights. I can't even imagine the torture. She said all they could think about was getting their next drink of water. Suddenly, the train stopped. They were now in Auschwitz concentration camp. They didn't know where they were yet, but later they found out. Suddenly, the train stopped. The doors of the cattle cars were abruptly swung open. They had no idea what was going on. That without a moment to stretch or move their body at all, there were orders being yelled and barked at them. Mom couldn't understand what they were yelling, but realized they were saying, "Leave your little suitcase on the train. You'll get it later." They never got them later, by the way. They had no idea where they were or what was happening. Mom thought that she was at an insane asylum. She said she could see people in the distance behind a fence, and they looked so strange. And she stared into their eyes, but then got distracted by all the yelling and barking going on. There was a sea of people being pushed forward because all of these trains were coupled together with other trains. So when they stopped at this destination, there are hundreds of thousands of people being shoved out of these boxcars all at the same time. So it was just a sea of disoriented people. They were quickly separated from each other. The men and boys were sent one way, and the women and girls another. The women had to get in line. They had to stand 5 across in line. They were so worn down, they walked like robots being pushed and shoved. Mom's aunt told my mother and her mother to hang on to each other so you don't get separated. When they got to the front of the line, the middle Nazi officer happened to be Dr. Mengele, who was one of the worst killers in the Holocaust. The Nazi officers didn't speak to the people. They weren't people anymore. They simply pointed their finger right or left. And my mom said, she's not stupid, she understood. You go to the right, I'll go to the left. Well, what happened was her mother went to the right. She waved to her and said, "Mom, I'll see you later." Well, later never happened. It was the last time. She said, sorry, it's hard to spit out. Sorry. Sorry, that's a tough one to spit out. It was the last time she ever saw her mother. The people were herded towards buildings, and they were told they were going to have a shower. Now remember, they've been mashed together in this house in the ghetto. Then they were put in a hot, sweaty boxcar for 3 days. So they were all pretty gross and were looking forward to the idea of a shower. But instead, it was just a trickle of water. No soap, no towels. She said it was barely enough to splash your face. After that, they were pushed into another room. They were completely naked, pushed into another room where there was a mountain of clothing. The clothing had a woman standing in front of it, and all she did was take a garment and throw it at the woman. So my mother ended up with a long slip, which is like a long nightgown, and no underwear, no socks, and for shoes she got these wooden clogs that had a leather strap across the top, and her entire life after that, she still had scars from that leather strap across her foot. Suddenly, they heard girls screaming at the top of their lungs and saw them running out of the building. They couldn't imagine what was wrong. They just looked so strange. Well, the same thing was about to happen to all of them. They were pushed into a room, and their hair was shaven. Not only their hair on their head, but all of their body hair. Then they were sprayed with disinfectant. So the sting from the disinfectant made them scream. And naturally, for a 17-year-old girl, just the idea of getting your hair shaved off, that's devastating in itself. I know my entire teenage years I had long, straight hair, and that was my identity. Matter of fact, when I see people now that I went to school with, the first thing they say is, "You cut your hair." So I can only imagine how horrid that was. There was something called food, but nothing anyone would ever eat. She said it was a green liquid with unspeakable things floating in it. It had a smell that could knock you over. The first day, she lifted it up to her mouth and couldn't even swallow it. She said it was just repulsive. And some of the people that had been there for longer were begging for it. So she handed it to them. She said, "Here, I can't drink it." Well, by the next day, she knew that she had to take a drink of it because that was the only food they were going to get. As nighttime approached, they were marched into a room. The room could have maybe held 200 people. Instead, they shoved in 500 people. 500 people in this little space. They were told to lay down next to each other. No blankets, no pillows. Their hard wooden shoes became their pillow, and the body heat next to them was their blanket. They would finally fall asleep, and at the break of dawn, the women guards would come in screaming and yelling, "Get up, get outside." There was no time to wash your face, brush your teeth, change your clothes like we're all used to. They had to go out in the courtyard, and they were counted. There were 500 women in this group. The Nazi woman guard would count them one by one. If she got to 500 and the number was off, she started again. Now, once again, this was a form of torture. It was hot summer. There were light-skinned people out there. They were standing in the beating sun and on pebbles on the ground, and they had these awkward wooden shoes on. So you couldn't even stand comfortably. And sometimes, if the guards were especially mean, they would make the women kneel down. And there, too, she still had scars in her knees from the pebble marks. It was all forms of torture. People often wonder why the prisoners didn't escape or fight back. Some did try, but they were rarely successful. The reality was there was no way to escape. They were in Auschwitz-Birkenau. There was no way out of there. There was electrified barbed wire fence. You can see some of that in that picture. There were guard towers, like that one, and with guns pointed at them at all times. And there were women guards walking around with guard dogs. On top of that, they were already so weak and had already witnessed so much brutality. Mom said that some of the newcomers, like herself, would ask the women that had been there longer, "When are we going to see our parents?" She didn't know where they were, what happened to them. And inevitably, they would point towards the chimneys. What were the chimneys? The chimneys were the crematoriums where they were actually burning bodies. And my mother said that you don't want to believe such a thing could actually be happening in this world. But she also said in her heart she knew it was true. The odor was beyond anything she had ever experienced and stayed with her forever. And a matter of fact, I've met some vets who also have described the smell as a unique and horrifying thing. They excuse me. They were in Birkenau, which was a subcamp of Auschwitz, and they too were destined to die. My mother defined the Holocaust, and I quote, as a premeditated, scientifically coordinated mass murder. This wasn't a war where it was good guys against bad guys. This was all planned out. After a few months, many people died around her. One day, women were ordered back out to the courtyard, and they were told to take their tops off. They couldn't imagine why. They had to march in front of the men guards. Now, there wasn't much bodily curves left because they were completely starving. Well, they found out later that the guards were looking to see if the women had any upper body strength. If so, they were selected. The process was called selection. And her, along with a group of 1,000 Hungarian Jewish women, were then selected. Now, she had to get back into a boxcar, which I can't even imagine. And from here, So she's now gone from Hungary up to Auschwitz, Poland, and now she's headed towards Germany. They were put back in the boxcars, and they arrived to a forested area and were marched down into a building. She knew they were being marched down, but had no idea why. The factory manufactured bombs and rockets. Now, most of these girls were in their late teens or early 20s. They had never seen a factory, let alone worked in one. But you'd be surprised how fast you can learn if you have to. It was Mom's job to load the bombs and carry them to a warehouse. She had to open the bomb, insert a hose with poisonous gases, cap the hose, and then carry it with another girl to the warehouse. The bombs were extremely heavy. Matter of fact, a few years ago, I was in Germany at the museum there, and they let me try to lift a bomb. I could not do it. I couldn't do it with myself and my friend. We couldn't lift it. So I can't only imagine how horrible that work was. They worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes during the day, sometimes at night, and that was to confuse them. It was purposely done. Among all these tragedies, Mom told of one nice story. She said in the munitions factory where she was loading these bombs, she had a guard assigned to her. And she said he always treated her nicely and was never mean or rude to her. And one day he did the kindest thing she could have ever imagined. He snuck in some green apples for her. Now, if he was caught doing that, bringing it to a prisoner, he would have gotten killed. So he risked his own life to do an act of kindness. She said it was the best apples she had ever eaten in her life. She hadn't had any fresh fruit or anything with flavor for months and months. It also gave her faith that there were still good people in the world. The days were long and hard. After a while, their hair started growing back, except their hair had turned orange. Their lips were deep dark purple, and their faces were lemon orange. The effects of the poisons had gotten into their system. Like if you think about it in science class, you get goggles, you get an apron. They had nothing like that. So the poisons were going right into them. After several months, they were told that they were going to evacuate the camp and be moved to a different location. And remember, they had no idea where they were going, what they were doing. They were just like zombies. And if you didn't comply, you were shot. That was it. They were pushed and shoved down an open road. It was later called the Death March. They slept in the cold, wet ditches. They still had the same clothes on them, only they were given a little spring jacket, but it was the middle of winter and absolutely horribly cold. They noticed that some of the women guards weren't with them anymore, so they were hoping that that meant something good. In the distance, they saw a barn, and her friends started fantasizing about what if we escape? What if we escape and crawl one by one during the night to this barn? They knew very well if they were caught, they'd be shot. It would be it. She also said they had absolutely no self-esteem. Part of them were saying, if we're shot, it's over with. And the other part of them was the strong desire to live. She always said you have to have faith, fantasy, hope, drive, determination, and the belief that tomorrow will be better. You really want to live. This is as close to a picture of the barn as we could find. We did computer searches, and after looking at thousands of pictures, she said this was the closest that she knew of. In the middle of the night, the women were terrified. They had made it to the barn. They hid under the straw and hay, and they were absolutely shaking because they knew the inevitable. The next morning, there were 2 soldiers approaching. She said they could see them through the cracks in the barn, and she said somehow they looked kinder, and they were yelling something. Fortunately, 2 of the women in the group understood English. They were saying, sorry, we are from... Sorry. We are from the U.S. Army, and we are here to save you. My mom said that the soldiers cried as much as she did. She said that she always acknowledged the soldiers from the 6th Armored Division of the U.S. Army, for risking their lives to save hers. We always acknowledge them. Okay, so here they are. They're liberated, they're free, and they have no idea what's going on in their world. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit about after liberation. We call it from slavery to freedom, but I'm also watching the time because I want to make sure we have time for questions. They were liberated, they were free. They had nowhere to go. During this time, she had become an orphan, a person without a country. She had no profession, an 8th grade education, and no money. But she was free. She had no idea if any of her family or friends were alive. She had no idea what to do or where to go, completely on her own. She had lived through unspeakable hatred, and yet this is the same woman, years later, that taught her children to not hate. When the soldiers were finding these women in the fields, they didn't quite know what to do with them. Let me check my slides. Okay. Okay, not there yet. Almost there. The government had said to the people in the neighboring towns that they had to take in 1 or 2 of these former prisoners. And my mother was allowed to stay in a house with an old German couple. And they had told her that they didn't know anything about the concentration camps. And even though in her heart she knew that probably wasn't the truth, she made a choice to believe that they were telling the truth. She didn't want to hold hatred towards this old couple that was letting her stay in their home. Well, all of her manners and her proper upbringing were coming through. They hadn't disappeared. She said her first piece of food was a slice of bread, and on top of it she put butter that was thicker than the bread. Of course, she got a stomach ache because she hadn't eaten anything in almost over a year, but she enjoyed the flavor. Mom was fortunate to be housed with another girl. They shared their tears, their fears, and their uncertainty with each other. They had a common history, a shared experience, and had lived through hell. They talked about what to do next and slowly processed all that had gone on in their young lives. As a matter of fact, they remained friends until the end. Eventually, a chaplain came to the area and interviewed the people and said, "Do you have any family living anywhere in the world?" All my mother knew was that she had an aunt and uncle in Chicago. That was it. No other information. Their name and the word Chicago. The chaplain turned this information over to some of the volunteer agencies, and they were actually able to locate her family. The family sent her two visas to America. Over time, she had heard that her brother was alive, but he was also in a Russian prison camp. So she made the big decision to go to America herself and right back to get her brother there. Her family welcomed her in Chicago, and all they had to identify her with was that 8th grade picture. Sorry, this picture was all they had of her and the two other ones. One evening, my mother's cousin invited her to a party, and she met this really nice guy, and over time they were married and had 2 adorable children, especially the little girl, adorable. She went on to night school to learn English and learn how to work in an office. She met a Hungarian doctor who offered her a job, and she said, "I know nothing about working in a doctor's office." And he said, "Don't worry, I will teach you." Well, they worked together for 40 years. It was a wonderful relationship. Mom became active in her medical association group and was even the state president. By the way, she hadn't seen her brother for 19 years by the time we got him to Chicago. And the Chicago Tribune covered the article. I don't know how they heard about it, but they covered it. And so it was quite the touching reunion. Mom passed away just a couple of years ago, leaving behind 8 grandchildren and 12 great-grandchildren. As years went by, she realized the world needed to hear her story more than ever. In the 20 years that she shared this story, she personally spoke in front of 100,000 people. We met presidents, politicians, leaders of every faith, and lots of teachers and students. I had the honor of being able to travel with her, and it was the most wonderful experiences of my lifetime. Remember, her exact words were, "My hope is that through sharing my story, I can personally talk about the horrors of the Holocaust to remind this generation of the dangers of hatred, prejudice, and discrimination." I'd like to leave you with a few messages. Well, that's a picture when she was 90. Her t-shirt says, "I'm 21 with 69 years of experience." I thought that was fitting. Sorry, my things are out of order. Wait, let me see how many minutes I have, because 2 minutes. The picture where she's in a hospital bed, this is a great story. We were on our way to speak at a university in Storm Lake, Iowa. We were getting on the plane, just to show you her personality and how dedicated she was to what she was doing. We were getting on a plane in Chicago to come to Storm Lake, and she stumbled getting on the plane, and it was like a little ramp going up, and she grabbed the bar on the side and went down, and of course everybody from the airport ran over to see if they could help her and call an ambulance, logical things like that. And she said, no, I'm fine. Let me get on the plane." So we get on the plane. There's tears running down her face. She's in so much pain. I had a bag of trail mix snacks. I poured it out and used the baggie and asked the flight attendant to give us ice. I've got it on her back. We get to the airport, and they had a car waiting for me to drive her the rest of the distance. By this point, she was in excruciating pain. She was nauseated. It was horrible. And I asked at the counter where the cars were if they would show me where the closest hospital was. And so I had my directions, and she absolutely refused to go. She's like, no, these people were so nice arranging the speaking engagement. I don't want to disappoint them. So I drove out in these open fields. I'm from Chicago. That's a big city. I don't know these country roads, but I remembered it was east because my GPS also went out. We finally got to Storm Lake, and the president of the university called and said, gosh, I was getting worried. You guys are running late. So I told her a little bit about what was going on. I said I had gotten her up to the hotel room, and she still was refusing to go. So here comes the president of the university. We get her to the emergency room. Meanwhile, she's talking away to all the paramedics. And they were like, oh yeah, you got to be there because we're all going to come tonight. This is a picture of her in the emergency room, emergency room of the hospital in Storm Lake, Iowa. And whatever call it, I'm looking at the president of the university going, we need to cancel this. It's like 6 o'clock, she's supposed to go on at 7. Let's just cancel it. And my mother, who at this point was almost 90 years old, turns over and says, well, wait, why don't I just Skype it? And everybody stops and looks at me and goes, does she know how to Skype? That's like FaceTiming. And I said, of course she does. So within minutes, the president of the university called over, students came with all the equipment, and this is her Skyping from a hospital bed, and she's up on the big screen in front of this big auditorium of people. So just to give you an idea of what kind of personality she had, she was determined to do it. By the way, she had broken her back. Not something normally you'd mess around with. But, okay, let me move on. That was such an amazing moment. In closing, I just have a few messages. First one is think before you hate. Not telling you to hate or not hate. Just think about it. Why do I hate that person? Is somebody telling me to hate them? Or what is it that's going on with me? The second is to protect your freedom. To be discriminated against is horrible. And the third is to stand up to the deniers. This was a very sad chapter in history, but it was in fact a chapter in history. And my 3 messages are, first of all, that you can live through anything. She lived through unspeakable horrors. She lost everything. She lost all her teenage years. But she didn't allow her hardships to take over her whole life. As you can see, if she got up and spoke to 100,000 people all over the world, we went as far as New Zealand. So if she had that kind of perseverance, she was able to not let all this horribleness take over her life. And you too have just as much strength as she did. The second is pick your battles. What's really the most important thing to you? Everybody's got something going on. Everybody's got ups and downs. Pick what you're really passionate about and stand up for that. And last, just be kind to others. Everybody's going through something. Be kind, do what you can, and stand up for the injustices of the world. Remember that your thoughts and actions make up who you are and what you stand for in the world. Thank you so much. I'll be happy to take any questions.
So at this time, we'd welcome anyone that has questions to come approach the microphone, and you'll tell the principal or teacher that's at that microphone the question, and then we'll let you ask. So we really welcome it. If you have any questions, come on down. Any of our guests, any of our students here.
I'm really nice. I'm easy to talk to.
people were at the barn house?
Oops.
How many people were in the barn house that she hid in when they were hiding in there?
That's a good question. I don't remember the exact number, but I from remembering her stories, I would say probably like 20. It wasn't a big group because they were so scared. And they didn't share their information with everybody because they didn't know if anybody in the group weren't trustworthy. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Get close to the mic.
How long was your mom at the camp for?
She was asking how long she was in the camp for. Altogether, all these different movements is just under 2 years. From start to finish. 2 years too long.
How did they survive that long without having food for a year?
How did they survive?
How did they survive so long without having food for over a year, you said?
I have no idea. I guess that would be a good question for God. Don't know how to answer that, and I don't know how to answer why some people lived and others didn't.
Okay, go ahead.
Why didn't the guards fight against Hitler when they knew everything was going on?
The guards, the Nazi guards, you know, I would have hoped that happened. She asked, why didn't the Nazi guards fight against Hitler? And I think part of it was they were so indoctrinated to hate the Jewish people and blame them for all the problems that they believed it. And that's why I'm always telling people to stop and think for yourself. Did somebody say to you, oh, they're bad people, we should hate them? It's like so wrong. But yet people did it, and the more people that did it, the more people added to it. And like I said, they were even teaching hatred to the children. So it became an acceptable thing. Oh yeah, you know, let's hate them. So it just reminds us all that you have to think about your words too. Think about your words, think about your actions. Okay, thank you.
How long were they in the barn for?
It sounded like just overnight. Yeah, but I'm sure it was terrifying.
How many speeches did your mom go to?
Oh, my stars, I have all the documents. If I were to say a number, it would probably be 10,000. We literally traveled the world, and I wish she was here telling this instead of me. But yeah, and I think it's, besides that she was a good speaker, she was willing to travel. She had a wonderful companion to travel with, me, and she was really on a mission to make the world a better place. Thank you. Oh, sorry. Hi.
Why did the people shave off their heads in the camp?
Probably they shaved off their hair because of bugs. They didn't want bugs or lice or things like that happening. And it was also another form of torture. So they were very, very mean.
Okay, go ahead.
How old was she when she first went to the camps?
It was her 17th birthday when she was pushed onto that boxcar.
How old was your mom when she died?
93, thank you. Very young, energetic 93, too. It was way before her time.
How many Jews were killed?
They'd say that 6 million were killed during the Holocaust, and there's some numbers that say 10 million. And there were many people that weren't Jewish that were also killed in the Holocaust. Like I said, he didn't like Jehovah's Witnesses, he didn't like Catholic priests, he didn't like a lot of other groups. And he didn't like the disabled, which means anybody that fell into that category, Hitler was happy to kill off. He saw no purpose in them. So it's all very scary stuff.
Did you ever meet your mom's brother?
Yes, yes. Showed the picture of when he came to Chicago. And, sorry, I'm going to try not to cry. This is a lovely story. We're at the airport. I was with my mom and my brother and I was maybe 10 years old. And I said, Mom, do you have a picture of Uncle Mike? Because I don't know who I'm waiting for. Sorry, this is emotional. And she said, she goes, he's my brother. I'll know him when I see him. And I was just like what love. Even after 19 years, to just know that that's my brother. And he was the kindest, gentlest man you could have ever known. And wouldn't hurt a fly. It is unimaginable that he was treated so horribly. I mean, one of his jobs in the Russian labor camp was to walk the minefields. They were like human guinea pigs. They were sent out to the minefields, and if they got blown up. So it was pretty torturous jobs. Thank you for asking. He was wonderful.
One question I had for you is, growing up with your mother, as a child, was she open in her storytelling, or was there a time period where she would not really talk about that time period in her life, and eventually something happened where she decided to open up and tell her story?
That's a wonderful question. Most children of survivors did not know their parents' story growing up. For the most part, it was just too painful. They didn't want to burden their children with it. They figured, move on, it's a new life, keep going. My mother, as I said, her personality was pretty positive, and even as a small child, I knew little bits of her story, and that was her way of keeping my grandparents alive. So I'd be playing with my dolls and lining up like the furniture in the playhouse, and she would go, oh, that's just the way your grandmother would have done it. So it gave me a relationship. And one day, to very specifically answer that, one day I'll never forget, my brother and I were walking past their bedroom, and my mom was laying in bed with my dad and just crying, like that horrible, deep down kind of crying. And my brother looked at me and he said, why does she watch that show if it's making her cry? And I said, well, I don't know, let's go ask her. We were maybe like 6 and 8 years old. And we went in there and we asked her. Well, in those days, they showed the documentaries of when they really went to these concentration camps after it was over, and they made documentaries to show what had really happened, including piles of dead bodies and things like that. And she said, I need to watch this to remember what really happened. And my brother and I were like, okay. I mean, at least she was telling us why she was crying. And I thought that made a difference in my upbringing. And to add to that, I grew up in Skokie, Illinois, which had a huge population of Holocaust survivors. The parents, for the most part, weren't talking about it. So the kids didn't talk about it. Kids of survivors had like a secret language. One day I was riding my bike with my friend Lonnie, and we stopped at Russ's house, and we left really quickly because his dad was really a grouch. And we're like, let's get out of here. And as we're riding our bikes back to my house, I looked at Lonnie. I said, what was that about? He was really rude. And he goes, well, his dad was there too, and he had a really hard time. That was the total of the conversation. That was it. And as kids of survivors, we all just sort of understood and let it go. Oh, and to add to that, when there was a Nazi march that was threatened in Skokie, and they were going to do it purposely there because there were so many survivors. So it was a way to really hit at the gut of the people who had lived through this. And what happened, the good part about what happened from that is first they blocked the Nazi march. But secondly, that the survivors started coming together saying, okay, we can't ever let this happen again, and certainly not in the United States. So they started meeting up with each other and talking more, and eventually there was a museum built in Chicago that's world-renowned now, so you'll have to do a field trip to the Illinois Museum. And so, but what I've discovered is truly most survivors' kids did not know the stories, or they learned it after the parent passed away. Thank you for asking.
Okay, one last question
Sure.
here.
Did she keep the tattoo of the number that she was given?
Actually, she was never tattooed because she was in Birkenau and she was ready to die. They were ready to be killed. Had she not gone into that selection group to the bomb factory, she most certainly would have died. But she did have a prison number. It was 23,763. And it was on all the documents because the Germans kept very good records of everyone they were processing and everywhere they went. So we have real documents with her name, her birthday, and her prison number on them. Can I add one more thing? We do have a website, magdabrown.com, and it was designed specifically for teachers. One of my daughters is a teacher, so we broke it down into like 5-minute segments. So if you're just talking about like liberation, you can click right to that. And the other thing on here is this is actually her second headstone, and my children insisted that her messages be on there. They tried to do a QR code, but the cemetery wasn't ready for that much technology. But I just wanted to add that in.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you everyone that watched on YouTube. Thank you to our guests that came here. Thank you students for being really awesome listeners through this. Let's thank Rochelle one more time for Magda's story.
Thank you.
Okay, students, you will go get your stuff, and then you will go to 7th period. So 6th graders in the back, go ahead and go.